Lesson 5 deals with harvesting energy. It means actually using energy in the cell. Now, a lot of this chapter is going to be very technical and, quite frankly, fairly challenging in terms of the large number of different facts and procedures that are listed in the textbook and in this PowerPoint slide itself. What I'm going to try to do here is I'm going to try to just give you the basics of what you need to know, rather than all the information in here. We're not going to expect you to memorize every single term over here, but we do expect you to know the basics of the process. Cellular energy, which means energy on the level of the cell, within the cell, the things that the cell needs to do in order to survive, is necessary. If we don't have cellular energy, the cells can't do anything. We couldn't last more than a few minutes. We could last maybe a couple of minutes without cellular energy, and after that the processes by which the cells operate wouldn't function, and once they wouldn't function, we wouldn't do things like beating our heart and creating nerve impulses to go around the body and things like that, and, well, frankly, we would be, dead. So we don't want to do that. So how do we avoid that? By producing cellular energy. There are multiple cellular reactions that transfer energy from energy storage molecules to energy carrier molecules, materials that use the energy generated by our food to store energy, and then those molecules transferred to where they are needed to go. The example we discussed before, and we're going to be discussing again, is the ATP molecule. Now, this is a quick diagram of the ATP-ADP cycle. Notice both molecules are composed of an adenine group. Adenine group is this thingamajig over here with nitrogen and hydrogen and whatnot. Notice both of these have one of these. That's really what is called ATP and ADP for adenosine, which means an adenine group. And the only difference is how many phosphate groups each one has. Phosphate group consists of a P, which is a phosphorus, with oxygen and hydrogen around it. So you can see the ADP, the adenosine diphosphate, which has an adenine group and two phosphate groups. And then on top you see the ATP, the adenosine triphosphate, which has an adenine group over here and three phosphate groups over here. And the cycle works fairly simply. You have, let's say you start with an ADP group, a regular adenosine diphosphate, and then this procedure, which we're going to learn about in this chapter, glycolysis, causes it to become an ATP. It adds a phosphate group. It uses energy that is received from food that we eat to add an extra phosphate group, to take this extra phosphate group and kind of add it to the ADP to make it into an ATP. Then the ATP is sent out to various parts of the cell wherever it is needed, and wherever it actually is needed to draw off energy to produce energy. And at that point, wherever it is needed, it's the process by which it releases one of the phosphates causes the needed energy to release, and whatever part of the cell needs the energy gets the energy in that way. But then it loses the phosphate group, and then it becomes back an ADP. And then it gets sent back to the mitochondria. Remember, the mitochondria is where this happens. Where this process, by the way, the process by which the ADP is converted into an ATP by adding the phosphate group is called respiration. And that happens in the mitochondria. And so it's a really simple cycle. You release the phosphate group to release energy where needed, and you add the ATP by adding energy in order to store it. The ATP, by the way, of course, has the potential energy, and the kinetic energy, the actual energy, is being released at this point in the diagram, where it's releasing energy and converting into an ADP, which has, of course, much less potential energy. And this process, the glycolysis reaction, this part over here, where you're making an ATP, you're taking an ADP and adding on a phosphate group, how is that done? How does the cell actually convert the ADP? Where does the cell get the energy to convert the ADP, into the ATP? Where does the cell get the energy to do this little addition over here? Well, the answer is it gets it from breaking down nutrients. Nutrients could be fats, and they could be carbohydrates, and could be proteins. A metabolic poison, which is obviously a bad thing, is the sort of thing, one of the things that poison can do is it can interfere with glycolysis when the poison has a structure that's similar to glucose but can't be metabolized. You eat something that the body thinks is glucose and tries to metabolize, tries to break down, and it can't do it. In the meantime, the body's wasting all this energy, the body's wasting all this time, all this glycolysis over here on molecules that are not able to release energy, and it doesn't have enough time to do the glycolysis that is necessary for the body to survive. That's one way in which poisons, of course, can be fatal. Now, glycolysis and the formation of ATP can be done with oxygen, or it can, in fact, be done without oxygen. The difference is, and we're going to look at this in a little more detail, is that aerobic respiration means respiration using oxygen, and anaerobic respiration means without oxygen. The practical distinction is that aerobic respiration can produce 18 times the amount of energy, the amount of ATP, than can anaerobic respiration. So obviously we want to do as much aerobic respiration as possible. Okay, but we'll get to that in a little while. Let's just look at glycolysis. Again, we're not going to focus too much on the minutiae over here. Glycolysis breaks down the 6-carbon glucose. Remember, all sugar, or the sugar that we're dealing with over here, has 6 carbons to release chemical energy. Glycolysis breaks down glucose for energy. Okay. Glycolysis has 2 basic stages. The first stage is the stage that converts the sugar, or uses the energy from the sugar, to convert the ATPs to the format that they are necessary in order to complete the respiration. And then the second stage is actually able to use that energy to convert new ATPs. Long story short, without going too much into detail, the first stage costs 2 ATPs. In other words, it uses up 2 ATPs, which are kind of like units of energy. When I say ATPs, I mean the formation of adenosine triphosphates. So, and then it forms, or the end result is that you have 4 of them. Essentially, when you undergo this stage of respiration, you get 2 ATPs. Congratulations. Now, for each molecule of glucose that is converted into the substance called pyruvate, you've got 2 ATPs. And that could be the end of the reaction. In fact, you can see this diagram over here with glycolysis. You need 2 ATPs, and you end up getting 2 additional, or 2 net ATPs out of it. You have the glucose, and you end up getting 2 ATPs. You also end up getting these 2 extra things called pyruvic acids. 2 ATPs and 2 pyruvic acids. If you don't have any oxygen available, well, that's pretty much the end of the glycolysis. What will happen is you'll have 2 ATPs, and the pyruvic acid that's left over will then either turn into lactic acid or ethanol. Either way, the body can't really use it. The body will eventually have to get rid of it. There are some things that we use lactic acid and yeast for, things like having bread. Actually, well, in yeast. Yeast is a kind of bacteria, or a kind of fungus, so the yeast doesn't actually form within us, but in yeast it turns into ethanol. Again, that's what we used yeast for. Is a little bit beyond the scope of the course, but the point is that at this point, the first stage over here with glycolysis, you're going to form 2 ATPs, and the rest of the pyruvic acid is going to get wasted and turn into lactic acid, turn into ethanol, turn into something that's pretty much not usable. Now here's the bad news, and that's not enough. The bad news is that's not enough. If we as human beings were only able to produce 2 ATPs for each additional for each molecule of glucose that we processed, it wouldn't be enough to survive. Those 2 ATPs are just simply not enough energy to give us what we need to survive. What we do then, but fortunately what we are able to do then, is we're able to go ahead and take the byproducts of the first part of the respiration and use oxygen that we have from breathing in from the outside to convert it and to produce a lot more ATPs, to produce a lot more energy over here. Cellular respiration, which means respiration with oxygen, what we discussed before, the aerobic respiration, breaks down the pyruvate molecules. Remember, before, in the anaerobic phase, the first phase of respiration, we got 2 ATPs, congratulations, and we got 2 pyruvic acids over here. If we didn't use the pyruvic acids, well, then the pyruvic acids went to waste. But on the other hand, if we're able to have some oxygen and to use that next stage, we can then use those pyruvic or pyruvate molecules to produce 32 additional ATPs, obviously a lot more. And this is done in the mitochondria. If we're able to do that, then we're able to produce enough respiration for us to survive. I mean, just to give you an example, if, for example, a person doesn't have any oxygen, a person can't breathe, well, they can still they can still live for a few minutes. You can live for maybe 5, 6, 7 minutes, give or maybe not even that long, without breathing. The answer is because your body can survive on anaerobic respiration for a few minutes, but not much longer than that. If you can't breathe, what's happening? You're not getting enough oxygen into the bloodstream. If you don't get enough oxygen into the bloodstream, well, then the cells don't get enough oxygen to do aerobic respiration, and all they're doing is anaerobic respiration. Some organisms, like yeasts, certain types of fungus, bacteria, things like that, are able to survive only on anaerobic respiration. We're not one of them. We and most other animals and need aerobic respiration in order to survive. So to sum up, what are the ingredients for cellular respiration? What do we need for respiration within our cells? First of all, we can use a form of energy. We can use glucose, which we eat through starches or sugars or things like that. We can also get it from fats, which provide a lot of energy. Remember, as we discussed before, whereas proteins and glucose only give you about 4 calories per gram, fats give you about 9 calories per gram, more than double. And other molecules can be converted into energy by entering cellular respiration at the appropriate stage, like fats and proteins. Even though we saw before, the aerobic stage of respiration usually starts only with a glucose, it can also be done, the body can also use respiration from fats and proteins. Some weight loss plans include eating low carbohydrate diet, and the logic behind that is that if you don't have any glucose, or you have very little glucose in the body will be forced to use the other things, will be forced to use the fats and forced to use the proteins in a way that's less efficient, in a way that if you want to lose weight, you want your body to be less efficient. You want your body to have to burn more food in order to lose weight. And so the logic behind, let's say, the Atkins diet or low carbohydrate is that the body shouldn't be able to do normal respiration. It would have to do respiration that's less efficient, that starts at a little bit of a later stage in the process. You can still survive, obviously, but the body will have to consume more energy for the same amount of respiration. Now, chemiosmosis is that last stage of cellular respiration, that last stage of aerobic respiration. This is the process by which energy is used to generate a concentration gradient of positive hydrogen ions, and some of that energy is captured in ATPs, in the adenosine triphosphates, as H-positive ions, hydrogen ions, flow down its gradient. What does that mean in English? Essentially, this is really the key part of respiration, because remember, the original part of respiration is only getting you 2 ATPs, not nearly enough. The thing that gets you all these ATPs, the thing that's so strong that's enough to power the human or the animal body, just with one molecule of glucose getting you these 36 ATPs, 2 of the original, it says over here, as we saw before, 32 to 34 ATPs, which means that one molecule of glucose can get you 36 ATPs altogether. 2 in the original stage and then up to 34 in the second stage. 36 ATPs obviously is a lot of energy. And the way it does that, long story short, is it generates these ions, these hydrogen-positive ions, in a high enough concentration. You can see over here, this is a kind of a very simple representation, where you have these hydrogen ions in high concentration over here, and that naturally causes them to move from one place to another within the structure. And this movement comes with a lot of force and a lot of energy, and that's what ultimately causes all of the energy that allows these 36 ATPs to be formed. Remember, all an ATP formation is doing is taking a phosphate group and using enough energy to weld it into an ADP to make it into an ATP. And then once it's done, the ATP, these 36 or 34 ATPs that are created, diffuse out of the mitochondria back into the cytoplasm, which is the rest of the cell, and then it can go to the rest of the cell or to other cells that need the energy. One of the things that cyanide does, and cyanide could be a deadly poison, could kill people. The way it kills people is cyanide inhibits the enzyme in the electron transport pathway. If the transport pathway is blocked, if this pathway, let me bring that back up on the slide over here. If this pathway over here is blocking these hydrogen ions from moving from here to here, well, then not enough energy is being established. And if not enough energy is being established, then the person cannot produce enough energy to keep on with the life processes. And finally, we have the issue of fermentation. Fermentation is the process of what happens to the pyruvic acid if there isn't any oxygen. There isn't any oxygen to continue the process of aerobic respiration. In other words, over here, you do the glycolysis to produce the 2 ATPs and the 2 pyruvic acid. If you have oxygen, you go to aerobic respiration. Otherwise, you do this stage, and this stage over here is known as fermentation. So glycolysis can be done in anaerobic conditions, in other words, without oxygen. And then the second stage is the breakdown of the pyruvic acids into lactic acid in something known as fermentation. The pyruvate in the cytosol, in other words, that has not yet been converted, has not yet been acted on by oxygen, it can't be. After a while, it just sits there and does nothing because there's no oxygen there for it. And it can either produce lactic acid, which is usually done in human beings, mammals, and certain bacteria, as you can see in this diagram over here, and in yeasts and certain other organisms, instead you produce ethanol, which is really a type of alcohol. So, and then in humans, you have in mammals and bacteria, you have the lactic acid that's being formed. That's the left side of this document. Now, when the lactic acid is being formed, that cannot be used. It just kind of builds up and is really a waste product in the human being. The muscles become sufficiently low on oxygen to perform glycolysis. Basically what happens is when a person is exercising, a person's running around, a person's biking, whatever it is, the body says, we need more ATPs, we need more ATPs, we need more ATPs because we know we need more energy, and the body starts respirating as many glucose molecules and other molecules, fat molecules, protein molecules, whatever it is, as possible. Then, the thing is, if you breathe in, no matter how much you breathe in, you might not have enough oxygen to get 36 ATPs for each molecule of glucose that you're respirating. And so because of that, kind of the pyruvic acids from all of this respiration builds up. And this causes fatigue, and it also could cause some discomfort as well. So during vigorous activities, muscles become sufficiently low on oxygen, and they do more glycolysis, and more really respiration to produce more ATP molecules, which produce a brief burst of speed. However, if there's not enough oxygen in the body, which is, by the way, also interestingly enough, why we breathe fast. When you run and when you get out of breath, when you breathe, you're breathing very quickly. And the reason why you're doing that is because the body's saying, hey, we need more energy. In order to get more energy, we need more respiration. In order to do more respiration, we need more oxygen. So the brain sends a message to the lungs, to actually really the diaphragm, and says, get us more oxygen, get us more oxygen. That's why you breathe very quickly in order to try to, you're kind of panting because the body's saying, get us as much oxygen as possible. So when a person bicycles up a hill, you feel a burn in your legs or fatigue in your legs. The reason is because your legs aren't doing enough cellular respiration. Instead, you're doing anaerobic respiration, and the lactic acid is building up in your legs, causing a little bit of discomfort. The same thing is true with bacteria. Bacteria also does anaerobic respiration, and bacteria in the mouth feed off the sugars that we eat and produce lactic acid, which cause cavities and also bad breath. The bacteria in our mouth break down the sugar and do anaerobic respiration, where bacteria and microorganisms like that don't do aerobic respiration, they only do anaerobic respiration. The other type of fermentation is done by yeasts and certain other materials and certain other types of microorganisms, and this is the right side of the diagram, the ethanol or alcohol fermentation. So in this type of scenario, when it's done by yeasts and certain types of microorganisms, the pyruvic acids are converted into alcohol and carbon dioxide, into ethanol and carbon dioxide. And that, of course, is why the carbon dioxide actually caused bubbles of carbon dioxide, which is why bread rises. Bread rises because you have the wheat molecules, or you have the bread molecules, and you have little pockets, tiny little pockets of carbon dioxide that blow them up and make them bigger and softer because they're more spread out, and that's what causes bread to rise. And it also is what causes alcohol to form. Grapes and things like that are aged in an area where you have these yeasts, you have these microorganisms that do aerobic respiration on the on the sugars in the wine or the sugars in the grape juice, and the pyruvic acid that they make ferments into ethanol, ferments into alcohol, and that's what eventually causes wine to form. So when yeast ferments, it produces carbon dioxide, which causes bread dough to rise, and a single yeast cell undergoes alcohol fermentation and uses 50 molecules of glucose to only produce 100 molecules of ATP. Basically, that's a review of what we discussed before, that fermentation, or non-aerobic respiration, produces only 2 ATPs per molecule of glucose, whereas aerobic respiration produces up to 36. And now let us look at some of the a couple multiple choice questions for this chapter. Okay, so let's look at the questions. In the absence of oxygen, suppose a single yeast cell undergoes fermentation and uses 250 molecules of glucose. How many molecules of ATP will be generated? Well, as we know, this is anaerobic respiration because it's a yeast cell which does only anaerobic respiration, not aerobic, and so it's only going to produce 2 molecules of ATP per molecule of glucose, so that's 250 times 2, which is, of course, 500. Easy enough. 2. Cyanide poisoning occurs because cyanide inhibits an enzyme in the electron transport pathway. Which of the following is the reason why the cyanide poison becomes deadly? We discussed this earlier. A. Cells switch to anaerobic fermentation. That seems to be correct initially, because it can only do anaerobic. It can't actually now use the oxygen to do aerobic respiration and produce the extra ATPs. Let's see the others. Oxygen is reduced to water. That I don't know what that means. Glycolysis stops. That's not totally true, because glycolysis is the first stage. Glycolysis is this stage where the pyruvic acid is formed, and that's not really what cyanide inhibits. So that's not correct. And ATP is no longer chemiosmosis. That actually seems to be correct. That's actually a more correct answer. Yeah, that's the chemiosmosis. Well, that's what cyanide does. It tries to do it tries to do the aerobic respiration, but doesn't quite do it. So A is actually a superficially attractive choice, but I think D is the better choice. So we're going to choose D over here, and I will see you at the next section.